Hey everyone, welcome to the Texas Outlaw Running Talk Show. This is your host, Briston Rains, and today we're able to have on Zach Bitter. Zach Bitter has held world records in the 100-mile distance and the 12-hour distance, and he's also a coach. He's a world-renowned athlete. He's very talented and hardworking when it comes to running, and super honored to have him on the show. He was also on one of the biggest podcasts in the world, the Joe Rogan podcast, and we get to talk about a lot of really good stuff on today's episode. Before we start, real quick, if you want to help support the show, there's a Patreon. The Patreon is linked below in the description, so whatever you're listening on, if you scroll down in the description, you can click that Patreon link. What that does is it allows you to donate towards the show, which helps us keep the show up and running and also makes the production quality a lot better. And so if you guys are feeling generous and want to help out the show, go ahead and do that. All the information is below in the description. And one more thing, if you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify, there's a way to where you can leave a rating and a review. And what that does is the more ratings and reviews we have, the more it gets out the podcast to people that either want to hear it or need to hear it. So the Patreon and the ratings, if you guys are feeling generous, go check those two things out. That's enough of that. Here's Zach Bitter.
Yeah, I grew up in the Midwest, spent most of my life in Wisconsin. So that was kind of my upbringing. But since then, I traveled quite a bit and lived in a few different places, including California and Arizona. But my wife and I met in about 2016. And at that time, she had been living in Dallas, Texas for about 10 years. So when we got married, we ended up in Phoenix for about 4 years, but then over the pandemic, our kind of careers shifted a little bit more remote, less travel, which opened up Austin, which would have probably been a place we would have considered with less travel in the first place. So when we kind of had that opportunity, it was heading back to Texas for her and me getting the Texas experience for the first time. But we've been in Austin for a little over a half a year now, and we're loving it.
Sweet. So y'all are currently in Austin right now then, right?
Yep.
You are? Awesome. Okay, cool. Yeah, usually I try to keep the show to where it's just Texas runners, but usually if it's someone like you, we'll let them on regardless, but they got to have some tie to Texas. So it's good to know that you're living there. And you said you were in
Yeah.
Colorado. What are you doing in Colorado?
Just taking a little bit of a break from the summer heat. It's
Yeah.
been pretty toasty in Austin this year, and we kind of got to get that in our routine from the years in Phoenix too, because we'd have some pretty toasty summers there. So we usually try to get up to Colorado a couple times during the summer and just break it up a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely wish I could take a break. I'm in South Arkansas right now, but I'm back and forth in Texas and it's ridiculous there and it's miserable. And so um real quick, I wanted you to go ahead and tell the listeners. I kind of do a brief before this, but tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and kind of what makes you who you are, some of your accomplishments. Just let them know a little bit about you.
Yeah, I think like holistically, I'm like a very curious person, and I've really like leaned into running as a way to maybe express that curiosity a lot. So, I started out getting interested in running just throughout a lot of different sports that I tried out in middle school and really kind of learned to love it in high school. Competed in college where I really kind of learned more about like kind of the hows and whys that you do specific workouts and training and things like that. And one of the big takeaways I had there was like that the long run was my favorite workout of the week. So it didn't take me too long after college to kind of get into ultra marathons. And in 2010, I did my first one. And by the end of 2011, that was kind of my primary training target were 50 milers. And 2012, I did my first 100 miler. And since then, I've kind of made that more of my priority distances to kind of go after. So it has been kind of a crazy lifestyle and opportunities that I would have never guessed I'd have. So it's been fun to kind of explore a lot of testing my physical and mental limits through the sport of running at the 100-mile distance, and then certainly some other ultramarathon distances as well.
So, what is it about? You said your favorite was the long run. What was it about the long run that enticed you so much to it?
I think there was just something about the way that you could do it for so long, which opened up a different element of kind of the mental side of things. So, there's a mental component to all the endurance races, whether they're like shorter, like 3 kilometers, or longer, like 100 miles. But when you get to the shorter ones, they are intense enough where you have these thoughts that kind of go through your head, but you have to be a little more laser focused, a little more tunnel visioned, I think. When you get into the longer stuff, you open up this like ability to kind of think, second guess yourself, ask questions, ponder them, and then
Yeah.
it opens up a whole different kind of dynamic that I think was appealing to me. It was also something I tended to be a little better at. I was pretty resilient with higher volume training plan strategies versus maybe some of my peers. So I could typically put in a lot more work at low intensity, high volume, and that just probably coincides a little better for race distances that are on the lower end of the intensity spectrum. And that ability to be
Yeah.
competitive at a national and international level was definitely something that I think was a motivator for me, especially in the early days.
Yeah. Yeah, and you talked a lot about, I don't know, you were using a lot of these like fancy words to describe some of your training. What got you into, because I know you're a coach, what got you into really learning the science behind running? What triggered that spark?
Yeah, I think when I got into college, I started not just saying or thinking to myself, like, well, the coach says we're going to do short intervals today, therefore I'll do those short intervals, and we're going to do a longer run on the weekend
Yeah.
and all that stuff. I just kind of got to the point where I was wondering, well, why are we doing this versus something else,
Yeah.
and wanted to know those things. So that's what kind of spurred it. And then from there, I think it just continued to grow when I started to realize that question and the why changes depending on the distance that you're going to race and things like that. So that opened up a whole nother world of training methodology. Ultra running is definitely a less explored world in terms of just the amount of research and science that we actually have behind training techniques and stuff like that too. So I also kind of like the relatively unknown nature, some of that too, where we're still very much learning like what are maybe the best paths forward or how certain things impact performance on race day versus others. And being kind of in the mix of that has been kind of a fulfilling journey for me as well, to go alongside just the training and racing itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And during that period of time to where you were really latching on to, the long runs and the ultra running and that scene, what did that look like? You ran in college, right?
Yeah, I ran for a Division 3 school, the
Okay.
University of Wisconsin Stevens Point.
Well, okay. And so what was that like in college? Did you have that desire and love for ultra and trail running then? Or what did that look like in college?
Yeah, in college, I had very little knowledge of it. So I was aware that ultra marathons existed. And my
Yeah.
high school cross country coach had told me about this guy named Dean Karnassus and how he was going to try to run 300 miles without stopping. And I remember at that time I think the furthest I had raced was like 5 kilometers. So just thinking of a scenario where a person would find themselves going like 100 times that far was just kind of a shock to my system a little bit, hearing that. So I kind of pushed that to the back of my mind though, for the most part, until I want to say it was like my junior year of college. I ended up reading Dean's book, and that was when I told myself, okay, someday I'll do an ultra marathon. But at that point, I was in my early 20s, and I thought like that's a sport for old people. So I'll wait till I'm at least 30 to do one. And as I kind of exited college and got more interested in things that went beyond kind of the collegiate distances that typically ended at about 10 kilometers, I started to kind of open that door a little bit about ultra marathon. And then one summer, it would have been 2010, I was just looking at what kind of marathon distance races were in or around Wisconsin. As I was doing that, I came across this 50 miler that was only about an hour from where I was living. And I didn't even know there was ultra marathons in Wisconsin. So
Yeah.
I just thought, hey, I'm just going to try this. And then if I don't want to do another one again for the foreseeable future, great, but at least I'll have that experience. So at age 24, I guess I dipped my toe into the 50-mile distance and loved it. And I think one thing that's maybe a little different about that is I won that race. And historically, I was a competitive runner, but there was always teammates and certainly other teams and things that were better than me by a fairly good margin. So winning a race outright was somewhat new to me, and that was another appeal to think like, well, maybe this sport has a little more to offer for my skill set, or another value add, I guess, into the whole process of the training and racing side of things.
Yeah. And after that 50-mile finish, what was your goal and your vision after that for the future of running and your running career? What did that look like?
Yeah, it was a little unnerving actually because I knew I loved it and it
Yeah.
was one of my favorite races to date at the time. So I was kind of in a weird mix of emotions where I was thrilled about the result, about the experience,
Yeah.
but I also knew like before that race I was very much kind of along the mindset of I'm probably going to do marathon and shorter stuff for another 6, 7 years or
Mm.
so, and I was sort of left in a situation where I was on the fork in the road, so to speak. So I actually ended it up kind of going back to some shorter distance stuff up until that following year where I did that same event. And at that point I was hooked. And then I did 2 more 50 milers then in the next couple months at the end of 2011. So after that, I was thoroughly on my way down the slippery slope of ultra marathoning and planning to kind of train for those specifically in 2012.
Yeah. And when did you start to have those goals in mind? Because I know at one point you had it was the world record, correct?
Yeah, I've held a few world
Yeah.
records. Typically, the 100-mile or 12-hour timed event are kind of where they were, and just different terrains. So
Yeah.
uh yeah, I mean that was another interesting part of the journey too, because when I got into ultra running, it was my introduction was mostly on the trails, and my mindset was that it's kind of more of a trail sport. And if you just look at like kind of the history of ultra marathon running in the United States and North America, the trail side of that sport grew a ton and a lot faster than like the road and track side did.
Yeah.
So I just didn't really have a whole lot of knowledge or insight that there were these very runnable courses, even though I was training on the flat roads in Wisconsin at the time. And I ended up doing a couple more runnable courses in 2012 and 2013 that kind of highlighted it to me just the value of racing and on the environment you're able to train in. So like training environment specificity, and did a 50-mile race just kind of on a whim about 13 days after what was supposed to be my goal race for that year, and ended up running a pretty fast 50-mile time, is like 5 hours and 12
Wow.
minutes.
Yeah.
And so just doing that 13 days after what was supposed to be a goal race got me really excited about kind of these controlled events. And then there's a race in Phoenix called the Desert Solstice Track
Yeah.
Invitational that does a big kind of record chasing age group outright stuff from basically 50 kilometers up to 24 hours. And I got invited to do a 100 miler there at the end of that year. So I signed up for that. And in that event, I just kind of was looking at the landscape and thought based on my 50-mile times, I would have a reasonable shot at breaking the American record, which had just been broken actually a couple months earlier by John Olson. And he was the first American to break 12 hours and 100 miles. He had run like 11:59. So I went there thinking, all right, if I go out in like 5 hours and 45 minutes for the first 50 miles, that should be sustainable enough that I can, hang on for like 6 hours and change or something and squeak under his record if things go well. And it did. And I ended up running, I think, 11:47 that day.
Wow.
So that was kind of my first taste of like a little more of an international or world-class performance, I guess. And
What pace
uh,
is that? What pace is 11 hours for that distance?
that race I think came out to like 7:04 per mile, I
Wow.
think, if I remember right.
Wow. And how do you build your body up to be able to hold that pace for that long? What does that look like?
Yeah, so this is where kind of the training methodology kind of comes into play. And the way I like to look at it is I think like all the workouts that you're going to typically see in like an Olympic distance training plan are still valuable tools. It just kind of becomes an order of operations thing where when do you do them and then what do you do as you kind of move through your training block. So I usually work from a principle of least specific to most specific, where early in my training season, I'm getting more efficient and adapting my body to doing things that I think are going to make me faster on race day, but are going to be the least specific to the pace I'm going to hit on race day. And then as I kind of get closer to the race itself, I start skewing more of the training load that I'm doing towards things that are very close to the intensity and the structure that I'll be doing on the day itself, so that my body and mind are kind of tuned into those skill sets. So a lot of times what that means is like the last maybe 6 to 8 weeks before a big goal race, I'll be kind of building out my back-to-back long runs on, usually it's a Saturday, Sunday. And I'll be doing usually anywhere from between like 3 to 5 miles, or I'm sorry, 3 to 5 hours at the intensity I plan to race at, and just practice the different things like the fueling, hydrations, dial all that in, confirm in my mind that that pace is likely going to be sustainable for 100 miles versus aggressive or conservative, and then kind of really come up with a race strategy when I kind of get that data compiled from that 6 to 8 weeks of kind of long run development. And that usually puts me in a good mental and physical place to be able to kind of trust it. And then it just comes to race day being honest with yourself. And I think it's one of those things where I think the mental aspect is the big player. Physically, even if it's getting difficult, the pace is pretty slow relative to what you could do. So learning how to kind of chunk the race in a way where you're not trying to wrap your head on 100 miles the whole day, but rather saying, this is goal one. I'm going to try to get to here and make sure I'm doing the things I need to do to make this sustainable going forward before kind of refocusing in on the next goal. And doing them certainly helps kind of come up with a strategy that works well for you, but also practicing things like visualization during your long runs I think is useful, so that in your mind you don't feel like you're as removed from the 100-mile distance when you get there. Because that is the one of the unique things about a 100-mile distance is you're just going to get nowhere near that distance in training unless you do another race that's that distance or close to it, which isn't necessarily a very sound like training principle for the most part. So you sort of want to avoid that for the most part. But you can kind of practice the mental side of things by doing things like visualizing what it would be like to run from 70 miles to 100 miles while you're doing like that 3 to 5 hour long run on a Saturday or a Sunday. And then
Gotcha.
when you hit that point of race day, you kind of feel like you've had a dress rehearsal in your head.
Okay. And Zach, I want to know, whenever you're broken or the long run just starts to get really mundane and you're just, I don't know, you don't have much to think about, what goes on in your mind whenever you're just in that pain cave or you're just trying to finish out a 5 hour run? What
Mhm.
what are some things that go through your mind?
Yeah, I think like it when I first would experience those, they'd be maybe a little frustrating. You think, well, what did I do wrong? Why is this not going more smoothly and things like that? And there's definitely worth considering those things, because if you're making a mistake, whether it's fueling, hydration, pacing, heat management, all these different things, just recovery from the previous training blocks and things like that, you want to make sure that you're being mindful of that. But they also kind of give you opportunities too, where, if you do a couple of back-to-back 5 hour long runs over the course of a training plan, there's going to be points during that where you feel less motivated, less excited to be doing what you're doing. And I think it's one of those things where you just have to practice the redirection of your mind. So you're going to get that same experience on race day. And you kind of are put in a point where you can go one direction, which is like a negative self talk, or you can go another direction, which is trying to look at the positives of it. So when I'm in those spots in training, I try to think, okay, I'm going to hit this spot in a race. And this is a hard spot to be able to practice on a regular basis. So this is my opportunity to work on kind of the refocusing side of it, looking at the positives. And one thing that most people will get from an experience standpoint, if they run 100 miles, and they'll certainly get it if they do multiple of them, is this crazy thing that happens where you'll hit a spot in the race where you feel like it can't get any worse than this. How am I going to go another 30 miles, 40 miles, whatever it happens to be? And then if you keep going, you eventually kind of push through that, and you might feel better than you ever have all day after going through that misery or being in that pain cave that you mentioned. And that's such a kind of a psychological, like, confusing point, I think, where I think our minds often think linearly, in the sense like, if it's bad now and I continue this activity, it can only get worse. where when it's just a little bit of a mental weakness versus a physical issue, then it can very much come back. So where I think it gets interesting is you'll have these races where you'll be able to push through those a little better, or you'll push through more of them than you typically would. And those feel good because they're breakthrough performances. Usually I know, like when I ran whenever I ran my fastest 100-mile time, there's a couple points during that race where I pushed through some lows where I probably wouldn't have in the past, which is why I had the day I did then and not on a different day. And like I said, those are really rewarding, but then they also force you to kind of reflect on the other times and think, okay, so maybe I wasn't as mentally strong as I thought I was at the time. And I need to be mindful of those limitations in future races so that I'm not leaving things on the table when the performance actually is there.
Yeah. Yeah, and would you say that, building that mental, fortitude to push through that pain, um, would you say that that's kind of an art form that you have to learn how to do, and you just have to keep practicing putting yourself in that physical condition to where it hurts to like push through?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, there's a balance because you don't want to overreach.
Yeah.
So I think this is really where like the right training approach comes. And when the way I like to describe it is like, and I was guilty of this earlier on too in my
Yeah.
career, where you get so invested in ultra running, where this long run is like this kind of pinnacle, this cornerstone of your training. It's like the like focus workout, and you want to do it as often as you can. So you find yourself with pretty lengthy long runs kind of throughout the year or throughout the training plan. And then you find yourself in a point where maybe you have more mental practice at pushing through low points, but you have a lot of kind of points where you maybe pushed past the proper training load a little bit. And then you kind of pay for it as you get further into the plan, and you pay for a little bit maybe from a motivational standpoint because you've exhausted yourself from that activity when it's time to really want to lean into it on race day. So what I find is, if you kind of are just a little more conservative on the long runs in the first, say, half to two-thirds of the training plan, and give yourself the opportunity to kind of focus on some of the more moderate and higher intensity workouts and building up a more moderate amount of volume before really leaning into the practice of that long run side of things, you give yourself enough of an opportunity to find those points and test them and confirm in your mind you can do it, but not so many that you've pushed past what your body can tolerate. You're overreaching on too frequent of a basis to the point where you're starting to move backwards by adding more versus getting better. And you show up on race day with the right physiological adaptations to do what you're trying to do, but you're also both mentally prepared and mentally fresh to be able to go out there and run the pace or the intensities you wanted to for 100 miles or whatever distance it happens to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and after that 100-mile world record that you were able to get, um, is that what put you on the map and kind of started? Is that when people really started noticing you and your how great you are as a runner?
Yeah, I've had a few races throughout my career that I think have been just kind of movers in my career.
Yeah,
So the first one was definitely that Desert Solstice race in 2013. That was probably the first thing I did that put me on, some of the bigger podcasts and things like that that were kind of focused on running and ultra running. And
yeah,
then in 2015, I rebroke my American record,
wow,
and that was a pretty big one too, where I got a lot of press for it. And then 2019 was probably the biggest launch. I had enough of a kind of a platform at that point where there were some eyeballs on me. People were aware that I'd been chasing the world record for a while. So when I would
yeah,
line up for a kind of a controlled track race, I think the assumption was that I was going to be going for it. And people like to see that, the record chasing stuff. And I wouldn't say that's my primary motivation, but it's definitely something that is a value add in terms of kind of structuring race goals and kind of keeping motivated as you're, pursuing whatever you're trying to do on that day. And that race specifically in 2019, as well as just my race that whole year, I had had a pretty diverse set of race results where I did a 100 miler in the mountains in San Diego and won earlier in the year, had broke the world record for 100 miles in 12 hours in August, and then also did some shorter stuff at a pretty high level, including the JFK 50 mile and then 100K on a track at the end of the year. So there was a kind of a body of work that year that was varied versus very one dimensional, and that usually catches some people's eyes. So yeah, going on Joe Rogan twice doesn't hurt either. So
Yeah. How was that?
yeah, it's
How
just
was
kind of
being
like
with
a little, there's definitely some focus points.
I'm sorry. I think it glitched out a little bit, but I was gonna ask you made it on Joe Rogan on the Joe Rogan podcast. What was that like?
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I was listening to his podcast at the time, so I was very aware who he was. And
Yeah.
I think one of his guests went on, Mark Sisson, and was just talking about kind of his nutritional approach, which is like fairly similar to what I would do. And Joe had just asked him like if there were any athletes that were kind of following that approach, and Mark had mentioned my name. So after that, Joe started following me on some social media channels, and he was kind of playing around with that nutritional approach at the time. So
Yeah.
I'd shot him a note and just mentioned to him that I had like been doing it for a while and probably had made most of the mistakes. So if he had any questions, I'd happy to kind of fill him in on what my experience was like. And I didn't really have any anticipation of him wanting me to come on his show, but he invited me on at that point. So I ended up going on, and I think it was 2017.
Yeah.
So chatted with him there for that one. And then when I broke the world record for 100 miles in 12 hours, he had asked me when I was going to be around LA again. And they went back on in December of 2019. So it was kind of two really cool experiences to get to sit down with him and talk about my lifestyle and some of my interests on one of the biggest podcasts in the world.
Yeah, yeah, that was really neat, and I think that's actually how I first found out who you were. Like I talked about before, way back, and that, and then Arabipa are the
Yeah.
two ways that I actually found out about you, and I've just always been kind of following you over the past couple years, and I know you're a pretty big advocate for Ultra. I've been wearing them for, man, I want to say 2 years straight, and I'm
Cool.
in cross country right now in college, and those are what I train in. And have you seen, which obviously I know you have, I want to know your opinion on the new, actually I don't know how new they are, but those new shoes that have the carbon plate in them. I want you
Yeah.
to,
Mhm.
I'm interested to hear what you think about those.
Yeah, so that shoe's called the Vanish C, and like most brands now, everyone's kind of coming up with a like a racing super shoe where we had a breakthrough. It was actually all the way back to like 2016 when some of the earlier prototypes came out from Nike, where we started seeing these shoes
Yeah,
that were showing performance boost from just an efficiency standpoint, all the way up to sometimes 8%. So that obviously catches the eye, and the governing bodies need to
yeah,
like look at it and decide like what are we doing here in terms of potentially like mechanically doping runners, and how do you make a
yeah,
play a fair playing field amongst all of that. So most brands are starting to catch up and kind of have their version of that shoe, and it's definitely a different experience, especially for me, because I historically have been a little more in line with kind of a lower profile racing shoe. So going up to a shoe where the more cushion you add to it, the more efficient it becomes, was a little bit of a transition.
yeah,
But it is kind of an interesting to be still competitive during a time frame when you're seeing like the sport kind of transition. And that comes with all the cool things like a bunch of records getting broken because now
yeah,
people have lengthened careers, better efficiency at race performance and things like that. But then also like the all the controversy with it, where it's like, what if one brand's model is better than another's? How do we kind of square that? How do we compare records from people in a traditional running shoe versus records that got broken in the super shoes, and then
yeah,
regulating prototypes versus in market stuff? And it's one of those things that like uh I'm probably spent enough time in running prior to super shoes where if I could wave a magic wand and not have them, I'd probably do it. But
yeah.
I
Why
also
is that?
understand that you're not putting. Uh, I don't know. I just think like to some degree, like when you can introduce something that doesn't actually take any more work, but is going to improve performance is where I start to feel like, it's
Yeah.
I don't find it as valuable. Um, but then again, the counter to that is, we've had, in the most endurance sports, probably a lot less in ultra marathon than like Olympic distance stuff. And in cycling is, you also had doping eras where people were taking things that were creating performances that were enhanced. And a lot of records were likely set without people getting caught doing that. So to some degree, is if the shoe kind of erases that gap a little bit. Now, maybe we can see some records get broken by clean athletes that are still following the rules, because the shoes are legal. So at a certain point as an athlete, you got to accept what is allowed. And if they're going to allow that sort of a technology, then you kind of got to get on board or get left behind, so to speak. But like I
Yeah.
said, I mean, I'm probably just been running long enough and old enough where I'm partial to the old tech. But
Yeah.
they had that same thing happen in cycling too when they switched to carbon fiber bikes and things like that. And
Yeah.
so there's some of that that's just going to happen no matter what you do, and you kind of got to not let it bother you and just kind of see what it is. So
Yeah.
but on the more positive side too, it is kind of cool just to like now have an opportunity to see like, well, let's test and see what of a difference this makes for me at the individual level, uh and compare that to previous performances and other technology.
Yeah. And with the zero drop within Ultra, what attracts you so much that that's how they do it? And they also have a very wide toe box. And so what benefits do you see from that in running performance as far as their brand and how they model their shoes?
Yeah, my favorite thing about Ultra footwear is their like overreaching philosophy is to kind of put you in the same position that you would be in if you weren't wearing a shoe,
Yeah.
but give yourself the protection from whatever environment you're going into so that you
Yeah.
can push back those kind of natural limiters. And balance cushioning is kind of the start for that. So, when you think about it, when you get out of bed in the morning and stand up or just walk around barefoot, you don't have a heel wedge propping you up. So you add that wedge, that's going to put you in a biomechanical position that's different than what your body would gravitate to without that there. So having that flat platform, whether it's one of their lower profile shoes or one of their max cushion shoes or somewhere in between, kind of, I think, puts you in a position where your body's likely going to be more receptive to moving within your own personal biomechanics.
Yeah.
And then the foot shaped toe box, I think, is going to give you a few different values. One is it's going to let you like splay your toes out a
Yeah.
little more aggressively versus force them in, which is going to help with things like balance and stability. And then when you just think of like the act of running, what you're doing is you're kind of pushing through your big toe. Your big toe is kind of that focal point. So if you have a shoe that is pushing your big toe inward, you're kind
Yeah.
of compromising the fluidity of which that you can kind of push through that. So
Yeah.
the foot shaped toe box also leaves that open and able to kind of power through a little better. This is a little more ultra running related, likely, but when you're running all day long, things like blisters, broken toenails, and things like that occur. So having a little more room up front is it's a little more conducive for that long time on feet that you get with the longer distance stuff that I'm doing. So those all kind of add up to make them, one of my go-tos.
Yeah. And do you prefer um the cushion that's the shoes that with the less cushion? Are those your kind of your go-to and what you prefer?
Yeah, that's what I feel best in. I do value some cushion shoes. I like to like look at it as like a shoe quiver where, there's going to be certain workouts that are going to be more conducive to certain types of things. And in order to kind of build kind of a strong overall foot or a foot that can kind of tolerate a variety of different things, having a variety of different shoes is going to help with that. So I'll use low profile firm things to really like kind of toughen up my lower legs, my feet. But then if I have an easy recovery day and my feet, lower legs, calves and stuff are a little sore from whatever I did, throwing on a cushion pair of shoes can kind of alleviate some of that initial impact, which will allow that area to maybe heal a little quicker.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think it's like kind of valuable to have a mix in there so you can expose your foot to a little bit of variety and kind of reap the benefits from that.
Yeah, yeah, and I was on Altra's website because it's coming around that time to where I'm getting about 4 or 500 miles on my Ultra shoes, so I had to. I'm buying some new ones, and I that's when I noticed the carbon plated ones on there. And so whenever you do go from low cushion shoes, and if you were to switch over and also add in those cushion shoes, um, is that anything that would possibly cause an injury if I were to just add in, those high profile cushion shoes into my training?
Yeah, it's possible. I think like with the super shoe technology, there's going to be some mechanical differences in the way it kind of protects certain areas. So you'll want to treat it the same way you would if you got a different pair of shoes that
Yep.
you've never worn before, where you take it out for a couple sessions and like just be honest with yourself. Like the later that day, that next morning, is there anything that's a little more sore than normal, or any aches or
Yeah.
pains that are kind of different, and let that stuff settle down before you take them out for another round.
Yeah.
So with the super shoes, they're going to be technically a lot more protective. So I try to avoid training in them to a large degree. I'll start bringing them into the rotation a bit when I'm kind of getting closer to the race and doing some key workouts, just so I'm
Yeah.
familiar with the mechanics and how I'm going to feel in them, and do let my body kind of adapt to that foot, that foot placement and the way that shoe is going to create my mechanics and things like that, but not so much that I'm starting to atrophy lower leg muscles because I'm in them all the time and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and so do you use those as your race shoes? Are those kinda your go-to race shoes? Those carbon plated ones?
Yeah, they have been
Yeah,
for like the last year or so, but up until about a year ago, I had been just racing in kind of a more standard, like racing flat for the most part.
cool. And what's your all-time favorite model of Ultra of one of their shoes?
So if I had to pick, I'd probably go with like the first version of the Solstice.
Okay.
Uh, the Solstice is to kind of transition into a gym shoe or like an overall sneaker that's going to give you a little more
Yeah.
lateral support. So if you're doing things like tennis, pickleball, or just weightlifting the gym, it's going to be a little more conducive for that now. But its original edition was like a low profile, light, very nimble, very flexible, kind of racing flat or low profile trainer. And that's the shoe I was using a lot in 2019 for road stuff, and wore for the race I ran 11 hours and 19 minutes in for 100 miles. So
Yeah.
that one's got kind of a unique spot in my heart.
So whenever you how did you find out about Ultra? Did you read, like, Born to Run like I did and then find them later? How did that work out?
Yeah, it's actually kind of funny. I didn't hear about ultra footwear from Born to Run, but I definitely kind of learned more about like minimalist
Yeah.
footwear, natural footwear, and things like that through that book. And then some of that movement had a pretty big flare up right around the time I was getting into ultra marathons. And I actually connected with a running store that it does isn't open any longer, but it's like in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, and they had like natural footwear was kind of their calling card.
That's
And
awesome.
yeah, their owner hooked me up with I think maybe 3 or 4 different pairs of like low profile natural footwear options, and ultra footwear was one of them. So I was wearing like a variety of different kind of natural footwear shoes for a couple of years there. And then after I raced Desert Solstice in 2013, I Ultra Footwear reached out to me and was curious if I wanted to look at a partnership with them. So I got that set up in 2014 and have been with them ever since.
Sweet. Yeah. Awesome brand. Like I definitely support it, and if anyone's listening, if you are to switch to Ultra, I do suggest, like, kind of like Zach was talking about earlier, like you need to kind of slowly build into, these new shoes, especially minimalist shoes. And so it's a great brand though. And
Yeah. The interesting thing about like natural footwear and minimalist footwear is, like you said, if you go from like a built up, kind of highly structured running shoe and decide to throw on like a purely minimalist shoe or like a Vibram five finger type of shoe, you're changing a ton of variables. You're like removing all the cushion, you're removing the heel lift, you're changing multiple variables at once. And that's usually where your body requires a little bit of catch up time. So where I think maybe ultra footwear shines is they have that full catalog of variety there. So if you're in a highly cushioned traditional running shoe and you want to get into something a little more natural, getting one of the more cushioned ultra versions is going to change maybe 1 or 2 variables, but not a whole bunch, to the point where you have this like really long transition or a heightened injury risk the way you would And then if you want to kind of work your way down as your body adapts to those first couple variables, you can start adding other ones like lower stack height, more firm, and that sort of stuff, and really make your lower leg strong over time. When I transitioned, I spent like 6 to 12 months kind of working into wearing lower profile shoes exclusively for a while. And I knew just enough at the time, probably not to make enough mistakes to hurt myself, which was good. But it is something you want to think of the same way you would like the weight room. If you have a goal of like being able to like squat, deadlift, or bench press a certain amount of weight, you don't just go there in day one and throw that weight on there and expect things to go well. You want to start
Yeah.
slow and adjust with your body as it gets stronger, and then you'll get there and you'll be stronger and more resilient for it. But you don't want to try to do it all overnight.
Yeah. And I think that's good wisdom you can apply to kind of most areas in life as well, is to just kind of ease into it, you know.
Yeah,
Really,
patience.
but like, you know, if you're starting a business overnight, you know, you're not gonna make $1 million overnight. And it's kind of the same thing a
Right.
little, you know. And
Mhm.
so it's just good philosophy to put in. And real quick, I'm gonna edit this out, but my microphone's disconnecting, so I'm gonna fix that real quick.
Sure.
I think we got the same microphone as well. Do you got the Yeti, or you got the blue microphone?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've been using a what is it? I've got a different one that I use at home, but that one's a little more permanent, so I don't bring that one with me. But this one works great to travel with. It's easy to pack and it
Yeah.
works every time. So
Yeah, I've had this one for quite a long time. Let's see if it's gonna pop up here. Yeah, there we go. Can you hear me okay?
yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I've had this one. This is the first thing I got about 2 years ago. It's been awesome. Easy to pack. So, all right.
Yeah.
So what we were talking about right before that happens.
I think we were just touching on minimalist
Yeah,
footwear.
yeah. I did want to ask you because I'm kind of in the same boat as you as far as when you were in college running, where I'm not the fastest, but I'm putting in a lot of miles. I love the long run, things like that, and just in general, is running at the level you run at, is it more is it equal to genetics and hard work, or does genetics play a big role into being able to perform at a level like you're performing?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think where it differs from like what you're probably doing at a collegiate level and the distance to come with that, there's going to be maybe a little smaller margin of people who could potentially get to like world class level, because the
Yeah,
pace and the intensity is just, there's going to be likely a bigger genetic component that is
yeah,
built around speed. Whereas you get to things that are like 100 mile, where you can have someone who's much faster at a given intensity. But since racing is down pretty low, like 100 miles, you're pushing up to your aerobic threshold, but going past your aerobic threshold is going to be kind of hard. And then there's also the whole mental component. There's just the way your body responds to that constant pounding, your ability to tolerate the different training strategy. And then when you push out into the mountains and trails, that's a whole nother skill set of especially technical terrain, where
yeah,
you
yeah,
you can be the fastest person on earth. If you don't know how to run technical downhill, there's guys that are gonna blow right past you
yeah,
just because they know how to do it. and
yep,
and yeah, so there's a lot more variables, I think. And when you add those more variables, you just have more opportunities, I think, to open it up to a higher percentage of the population in terms of being able to compete at a higher level. And I think there's just a little bit of when you get distances that long, there is at least a little bit of, if I can do more, it will benefit me on race day. Some of the shorter distances, it's going to be, like I said, a little more leaning into the speed work component. So it's like, can I run X pace for this duration at a higher intensity? And that's just a little harder, I think, for you to get to if you don't have some genetic gifts. And it's also, ultra running is younger in the sense that it's just not been as popular as Olympic distance sports. There's less people that get to it versus anyone who does high school or even middle school track and field and
Yeah.
cross country for a year has been exposed to that sport. So you get like an attrition equation too, where I'm competing against a much smaller percentage of the running world than, say, the world record holder for the 10K, the half marathon, the marathon, and those distances. So there is that as well. You have a little bit of a shallower pool, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, and physiologically, running really does change our bodies a lot. You know that. And something I genuinely want to know is I'm still young, but I do plan on having kids sometime in my life. And when I do, my genetics are terrible. They're absolutely terrible as far as running goes. And so if I were to keep on running, which I plan on doing, would they get kind of in a way like a running gene? Like would they be able to benefit in running off of me running for, 10 years straight or something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think your genetics would be more or less set. So I don't know that they would necessarily benefit from you running more. You might just have to pick a really fast wife.
Well, luckily the girl I'm about to marry, she's my fiance. She actually is really fast, so it might work
There you
out.
go.
So,
Yeah, I think like there's a component I think too where it's just the exposure to the sport at an early age is going to make a difference too. I think we see that culturally too, where you see some of these areas of the world that produce fast runners on a regular basis.
yeah,
A lot of that also is just like, you get kids, they're going to grow and they're going to adapt to what they're exposed to. So as someone who's younger gets in the running earlier, they're probably going to grow with the sport a little better than, say, someone who maybe gets into it middle of their life that's not like quote
oh
unquote
yeah,
like typically like a running type of person. And I mean, I say that like exclusively for the mindset of like, is making the Olympics a potential for X individual.
yeah,
Like anyone, regardless of whether you're, the an offense lineman on a football team, or you're, the captain of the cross country team or something like that, can make big improvements by starting where they're at and sticking with it. So I think when you look at it through that lens, we can all be runners and we can all kind of get that same experience of making career progressions if that's a sport you want to focus on. And that's actually another area that I really love about ultra running in the more recent
yes,
years is I think the pandemic had a lot to do this. Getting folks like Cam Hanes, David Goggins, Joe Rogan to talk about ultra running, trail running,
yeah,
and put a big spotlight on that sport has brought in people that would otherwise probably not consider it because they're seeing it as like a challenge or a means to an end. If you're someone like Cam Hanes, who's going to do like a 20-mile hike into the
yeah,
backcountry and, hunt for elk, he needs to be able to be on his feet all day and tolerate a lot of physical and mental adversity and things like that. So you're getting a lot more people from those communities saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to sign up for this 50-mile race, and preparing for that's going to make me a better participant in maybe whatever I'm more interested in, whether that's like backcountry hunting or fishing
yeah,
or anything really.
yeah, and Cam Hanes, he released that book, and I've read David Goggins' book, and I want to know, have you written a book yet? I didn't do any research to see if you have or not.
I haven't. I think I'll probably do one at some point. It's
Yeah,
just I've had an opportunity at a couple times in my career, and it just didn't really feel like the right time to do it. So I've sort of put it off. But
yeah,
I think I will eventually. Like right now, I've been stayed pretty busy with just the training and racing, and then podcasting and or putting together training plans. I like to coach like at the individual level as well as make
yeah,
like pre-made plans and things like that. So I've got a few things on that side that I want to make sure I have kind of fully exhaust or leaned into. And then I think maybe some sort of book or something like that would maybe come next.
yeah, yeah. Well, I'll be excited. I'll be looking out for it whenever it does eventually come out. Um, Real quick too, I wanted to touch on this, and it seems like you're kind of in this way, but do you have a, I don't know if this is scientific, but do you have an addictive personality? And if you do you see a lot of that in running?
Yeah, I think it's probably hard to justify not having addictive personality if you find yourself running ultra marathons, at least
Yeah.
to some degree. I think it's definitely something that I you got to be aware of, because if you look at it, I mean, it's like any addiction where on the road to like full blown addiction, there's like a healthy stopping point there, most likely,
Yeah.
that if you cross over, it becomes unhealthy. So, learning like what makes this thing I enjoy sustainable so I can enjoy it for as long as I want versus having it be taken away from me because I get too like kind of just consumed by the addictive side of, say, like I want to go do a long run every weekend or something like that,
Yeah.
is a balancing act. And it's something I think thankfully I learned throughout my career well enough that I'm still around and haven't had the sport taken away from me before I'm ready to leave it at this point. So but I think, like, it's anything, like if you have those type of traits, I think can be very positive if you channel them in the right direction, or they can be very negative if you let them kind of go uncontrolled or
Yeah.
channeled into things that are destructive. So there's definitely a long list of things I could lean an addiction into that would be way less conducive to my well-being than running. So I'm kind of happy that's probably helped
Yeah.
me avoid some of those too.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you know what causes that addiction switch in some people's brains to just have that addictive type of personality?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know for sure. Like, I'm sure there's some genetic component where some people are just more likely to get addicted to anything, or they're have a harder time breaking away from something that has an addictive property to it. But I think even when you get beyond that and just look at anything as a whole, I think if you find something that you're passionate about, that's gonna sort of ignite that side of anyone's personality. And for me, that was running. Like, I learned early enough that I could really like get energies out through running, as well as test physical limits and express like my curiosities through that, whether it's the act of training itself, the race itself, or the things that kind of come along for the ride that help promote those, like sleep quality, nutrition, and things that are going to be impactful, that you can also focus on and research and fine tune and really use to kind of help promote what you're trying to do. So I think the more you explore a passion, the more you're like different things that kind of go along with it start to pop up, and it's almost like an endless number of things that you can kind of turn your interest towards if you get a little stagnant with some of the other stuff that get a little more kind of second nature after a while.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely found that whenever you find something that you just genuinely love or you're passionate about, it doesn't even feel like it's work, I guess I could say. And that I think that's
Yeah.
key for people in
Uh-huh.
their lives as far as happiness goes, is defining that thing they're passionate about and turning that into, I wouldn't say your entire life, but most part of your life. And
Mhm.
I feel like that's really important to weigh in whenever you're doing that. What wisdom have you gotten from running? Because I mean, you've done some amazing things within running in the running world. What wisdom has that brought you?
Yeah, I think it is. I think the biggest kind of overall theme that I've learned from it is that, like, if you give something enough time and you're patient with it and you stay interested and you continually are honest with why you're doing it, and that why is a healthy why versus maybe an outcome driven why versus an inwardly motivating why, you're going to put yourself in a position where if you do it long enough, just from the number of repetitions you get, you're going to get quite a ways. And that can be translated into something like what I've done with running, or it can be, a business, or really anything you want to channel that energy into. So that has taught me a lot about just like what consistency and hard work will produce, regardless of what the target is. And then when you kind of back up from that and look at it in a little more of a micro timeline standpoint, is just like, well, what goes into like all these pieces that eventually line up to that, and how do I use those as both motivators and like gauges to assess if I'm doing the right or wrong thing, to make sure I'm continually heading in the wrong direction. And the longer you do it, the better you get at recognizing those and
Yeah.
learning how to adjust those. And that's just going to promote the overall goal a bit, to the point where you get to a spot where you find yourself in a position where you've done 10 years worth of progress, and for someone to catch up to that, they got to put in that time too. So it's a very good lesson that I think I've used for pretty much everything I've done. It kind of follows that same mindset.
Yeah. And and with that, I kind of want to go a little bit deeper here real quick, and this is kind of one of the last things I want to go into. There's two things I want to ask you about. First thing is whenever you're running, a lot of times you like really you really have this I don't know how to explain it. You have this kind of talk with yourself literally about existence. And I think you know what you understand what I'm saying. Like you're running and you're like, wow, like I'm here running. You're looking up at the skies and how beautiful everything is, and you're a curious person. So what thoughts do you have about our existence, like as you're running, when you're having those deep thoughts when you run, if you even have those thoughts?
Yeah, running is definitely an activity that kind of allows you to explore your mind a little bit
Yeah.
and like where you fit and everything. So, I mean, think about anything from, just the being in the moment side of things, of just like, this is an opportunity to let everything else kind of melt away and focus on just the movement. And that's actually what kind of drew me to some of these more controlled environments, because that's one of the things that I think oftentimes people wonder about is like, well, why are you doing 100 milers on a 400-meter track versus out in this beautiful like trail point to point? And I love those environments too, and I think they have a lot of value. But one thing I really love about these controlled environments is they it's almost like a sensory deprivation experience, in the sense that you control so
Yes.
much. You can think about every little thing, like your foot strike and how your arm is swinging on one side versus the other, and you can really pay attention to these things and kind of clear your mind a little differently. So I think like running in general is good for that, in terms of kind of resetting that or wiping that slate from all the stresses and anxieties that kind of come into just, living in the modern society where, you can reach almost anyone online or learn about anyone online or anything online. And it's like, those are all super valuable things, but they're also very capable of cluttering our mind, because we literally have the world's history in our pocket now with cell phones and things like that. And information is much easier to get than it ever was before. So running, I think I look at more of an opportunity to kind of turn that stuff off in a lot of cases, and remember that you are just this like biological thing that is going about our day. And then that sometimes leads to things like, well, where do we fit in this? And the kind of obvious one is like, what does the ant think when he sees us? Do they us? And it's like, where are we compared to that? Is there something that is like equally as impressive compared to us, that's looking down and saying like, what is the monotony of that? And like, where do they find value and things like that? So
Yeah.
it definitely gives you those opportunities to let your mind wander.
Are you into any like crazy theories or conspiracy theories?
um yeah, probably. I think I guess what I would say is like, I find those things incredibly interesting.
Yeah.
And then like whether they're accurate or not is like, I mean, there's the extreme ones that are like probably way out in left field, and there's the ones where it's like they're probably partly true, partly wrong, and there's the ones that turn out to be completely true. And it's like, I think the relative unknown or uncertainty with it is what's interesting about it, because some of it, it's like there's no actual answer to the end of it, and not having that concrete endpoint that you can explore is kind of the fascination behind it. But to some degree, you also got to be careful so you don't end up in a cult or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And
I do believe we landed on the moon, if that's what you're asking.
okay, I was gonna get to that and ask. Yeah. Yeah, there's one that I've really been getting into. It's called the Hollow Earth theory. Are you familiar with it?
I've heard about it, but I don't really know anything of it.
Okay, it's actually there's some like crazy stuff behind it. You should get into it, or at least look into it and go down the rabbit hole like I did after
Okay,
this. But
I'll
it's
check
really
it out.
interesting, and I mean it has some evidence behind it, and it's a possibility. It has to do with Antarctica and stuff, so it's real neat.
Okay.
But yeah. And then the last question, I've been wanting to ask this question the whole show, and I wanted to save it for last because I feel like it can be an impactful, depending on your answer. But what's your reason? What is your reason to push through whenever it hurts, and what's your reason to keep going for bigger things in your life?
hmm Yeah, I think my number one reason or my number one why it's shifted a little bit, but it's always been there. I've just been more aware of it. I think a few years ago up till now, which is just like I'm just really interested in like getting to a point where I feel like, okay, that was where my potential ended. And like take like the 100-mile distance, for example. If I get to a point where I run a race and I'm like, there's no way I'm going a second faster than that. That was my ultimate potential. Everything beyond this is going to either be equal or slower. That's probably when I would say I'm going to start focusing on a different aspect of the sport or a different thing altogether. So just by the nature of that kind of clear cutoff is probably like an indication that that's my big driver. My big why is kind of that exploration of like, how far can I push my body specifically, and then walk away knowing like, yeah, that was all I had and all I had to give, and I have no doubt about it. So that's like the quest that I'm on, I guess, or the question I'm trying to answer. And I still think I got a faster 100-mile time in me, so I'm gonna stick with it for a little bit longer at least.
Cool, man. Yeah, I'll be watching. We'll all be watching, man. That's good. Well, we appreciate you, and I appreciate you. And right before I do cut it off, do you have any last words for the listeners? Most of our audience is in Texas, and they're trail and ultra runners. Do you have any, I don't know, just advice or any last words for them?
Yeah. I think one thing I always like to share with ultra runners and trail runners and things like that is it's cool to kind of get invested in some of the longer stuff. And the sport does really emphasize kind of the like, if 100 miles is good, 200 is better, and that sort of thing. And but don't kind of lose sight of just the like the enjoyment of it, and just the variety that you can build into a training plan. So build a plan with benchmarks in it where you're going to look at like, how am I going to improve within this 3 to 4 week timeline, as well as how am I going to get to where I want to be in 16 weeks, 20 weeks, 24 weeks, however long the entirety plan is. And kind of having that structure built into it and those rewards that you can sort of focus on is going to just make the whole process enjoyable. So the way like you round, I think that out is like, if you prepare for a race for, a third of the year, half the year, whatever it happens to be, and the race doesn't go according to the plan, if you can walk away still happy and excited that you went through the entirety of that process, even though that end race didn't quite pan out the way you wanted it to, you're more or less doing it for the right reasons. So that's the gold standard, I think, with when you're getting into a sport like this, is make sure it's something that you enjoy on the day to day, as well as kind of hitting those goals that are going to maybe happen a couple times a year or a few times a year if you're really fortunate.
Sweet, man. Well, we appreciate it. All right, everybody. That was Zach Bitter. Thank you all so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to leave a rating. We do a show just like this every month. It releases on a Saturday, and we have a special guest come on the show that's really well known and did some really great things. And we interview them, ask them all kinds of questions, and really just get to know who they are. We also do a show called Shooting the Bull. That's every Monday. So we release a podcast every Monday, just something to listen to while you're going to work, or just something little to get you through maybe a little workout, whatever. It's me and another buddy shooting the bull. And so that's Shooting the Bull. And then we have these episodes. So that's kind of what we do here at the Texas Outlaw Running Talk Show. One more thing, if you guys want to support the show, there's a Patreon. Patreon's a donation tool to where you guys, if you're feeling generous, y'all can donate towards the show. It helps keep it up and running, and it makes it better. It makes our quality better, and we reinvest that all right back into the podcast. So if you guys want to help out, link is below. But that's enough of that. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of the Texas Outlaw Running Talk Show with Zach Bitter.